Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to today's lecture of epidemiology, which is going to be about causation in medical research. By now we have gone through most of the different epidemiological study designs, and I thought it's very important for you knowing the different types of how to conduct different types of studies is to get into a little bit of the basics of how to interpret your findings, whatever was your choice of a study design. And there are things that are there and present in every study that you need to be aware of, because unless you're aware of these problems or issues that might arise during your conduction of the study, whether at the very beginning during a study, designing your study, or collecting your data or interpreting your results, unless you're aware of the possible and potential problems that might be there that makes your findings less accurate, you won't be able to avoid them. So I thought it's necessary here to understand how to make your study more accurate, and there are certain terms that will be introduced in today's lecture that will help you understand this better. So let's get started. In today's objectives, we will first try to understand how to differentiate in epidemiology between the terms correlation and causation. And if you have noticed that in many of the tutorials or in the lectures I have given you before, that I was very careful in interpreting the results, is not to say that certain exposure is causing certain outcome, and we were trying to avoid using the word causing, and we replace it by related to or associated with or carries a higher risk of having so and so on, and we will understand this a little bit better today. Second thing, we will introduce the criteria that is being set there that helps us somehow to decide whether the exposure under study is actually causative of the outcome of the study. And then we will move to talk about the concept of bias in medical research, and what different types of bias that can be there, and we understand the different types. And then we will come to introduce also the word confounding, and what does confounders mean in medical research. And then we will talk about also random error and how it occurs in your study and how to avoid it. And these three terms are all considered to be weaknesses or errors in your study that you need to be aware of to avoid as much as possible. Then number 5, so we introduce the different types of bias, and then we understand finally the term of the internal validity versus the external validity of a study. So it's a little bit condensed today, so we'll try our best to keep it within our time frame available. Now let's start our lecture understanding more about what we have already mentioned about the word correlation or association versus causation. So when we say correlation, it's when we say that researchers found a correlation, which also can be called as association, and this is the term probably that we are using more often. What they're saying is that they found there is a relationship, let's put it this way, there is a relationship between two or more variables, and these variables are mainly the exposure and an outcome, or an outcome in certain exposures in case control studies. So you found that there is an association, there is a relationship, but you are still not 100% sure or confident to say that X causes Y, or Y has been caused by X. This relationship or this correlation or this association can either be in the positive direction or it can be in the negative direction, i.e., either when there is certain exposure that will makes it more likely for an outcome to be there, or sometimes, and that is a positive relationship, if that X exposure is present, Y exposure, Y outcome will happen. So this is a positive correlation. But sometimes there is a negative correlation, because we know sometimes if we are talking about diseases that certain exposures are preventive. So sometimes if an exposure X is present, then the outcome Y will be absent, and that is a negative correlation. But why do we keep saying correlation, and then why it's very difficult to say it is causative? Because there is other variables in real life. Normally these other variables do affect the relationship that is being studied between X and Y, and the researchers might not know about them. And there are certain variables that are very common to affect different things in our life, and that's why people always consider them in their research even if they are not studying them, like the participants' educational level, participants' gender, participants' age, because these are things that are affecting many things in our life. Yeah, participants' mental health issues could be also behind the relationship. This is of course not only restricted to these, but it depends what you are looking at, and you have to think not only about X and Y, think about all the other variables, all the other characteristics that are around your sample that might affect this X and Y relationship, because we are not in a bubble, we are not in isolation, we have differences, and we know that different diseases can be affected by different things in our life, and sometimes there is more than one factor that affect a certain disease or an outcome. So these are the variables that some of them we know about, some of them might be hidden and we cannot anticipate, and because they are there and they might have an effect that we cannot measure or control for, that cannot be a direct causative relationship, but there is some sort of an association. There is a partial contribution of that relationship, and there might be other contribution of other factors or other variables that we are not aware of. And this what we call as confounders, as we're going to come and to talk about it a little bit in more details later. How do we control for all these things? Usually researchers, and this is the last point in this slide, they have a number of sophisticated statistical tools. Now the SPSS program, there are different models that you can put all these variables, and they control for all these different extra variables that are there that you're not studying, like their educational level, their employment level of your participants, their age, their gender. You can put it all in different what we call as models to control or to suppress them or to take care of them, so we can purely study the effect of our X of interest, which is our exposure, for example, on our Y outcome of interest, and we can control all these things. Although we do this with the best analysis circumstances, correlation is still not the same as causation, and we are still being careful, and whatever results we get, we still interpret as X is associated with Y, rather than saying causing Y. All right? If we come to talk about causation, causation means that the researcher found that a change in one variable they measured will directly cause change in the other without any other pathways. So any change that happened in X will lead to change in Y, and that is a direct relationship, and this is very complicated conclusion and very sophisticated conclusion to reach to, and it's not easy as it sounds, because as we said, most of the research you read about will indicate correlation variable, not causation. They will always say, for example, as you can see in the second point, men were found to have more so and so, or women were more likely to have so and so. So these words are all indicative of correlation or association rather than causation. And there are sometimes risk factors and there are causes. And in epidemiology, we believe that they are not the same. Risk factors are not similar as causation, and we'll give an example for that. For example, they have found, or there is well-known facts that, for example, women's risk of breast cancer is higher if they were living, for example, they were found that it is higher risk for those women to have breast cancer if they were living in North America, and if they were having a high socioeconomic status, they found to be more at risk of having breast cancer, and if they were never married before, and if they were from the religious being Jewish, for example. These are found to be a high risk group, and these are not actually direct causes of breast cancer. Are they actually the direct cause of breast cancer, or they are risk of something else that causes breast cancer? The answer will be it is something else that is related to these factors that causes breast cancer. And they came to understood, like epidemiology came to understood that they are not the direct. They are, for example, a distant rather than proximate causes. For example, those women being never married are at increased risk. It's not because the marriage itself, okay, to the marriage itself, but actually more likely because those who are not married are most likely childless. Yeah, and because they are childless, it's the childlessness in turn that is associated with breast cancer rather than the marriage itself, and so on with the other factors. So these are more of risk factors. Yes, there are risk factors associated, but it's not the direct cause, but actually something else associated with these factors that are the direct cause, and this we came to know later. And these, but they're still considered to be risk factors. In contrast, consider, for example, we are looking at causes of automobile fatality. Okay, those who die being an automobile, whether it is a motorbike or vehicles. So the direct causes, for example, of these are being speeding, presence of a road that is hazardous, with a hazardous condition, time of the day, for example, those who are working in the evening shifts are more tired, more sleepy, and that is a direct cause for them to be involved in automobile accident. The level of traffic, the mental state of the driver, these factors are more proximate, more direct to cause and produce an effect and result in a consequence compared to those that we have mentioned about breast cancer. So those about breast cancer are more like risk factors, but when we came to talk about these different causes of an automobile accident as an outcome, those were more of direct causes. And I hope that you can see the difference in here. All right. Now, there is a person called Hill. Hill tried to gather all the different criteria being put by different researchers before him whom have tried to put certain guidelines to try and help researchers to see if all these criteria are present in their study, then it is more likely for the relationship that they have discovered to be actually causative rather than to be of just an association. And these are summarized in 9 different points, and it's important for you to be able to grasp the meaning of each and to understand that how each one of them actually contributes to the criteria to decide about a certain causative relationship. The first one is the strength. He mentioned about the strength of the association, and he said that when we come to talk about association, we get it as odds ratio or relative risk ratio, and these number, the stronger that number is, the more that it's indicative of more causative relationship rather than an association. For example, the risk of dying from lung cancer among smokers is estimated to be 10 times, for example, greater than that of non-smokers. And you can see that, for example, if the risk of dying from lung cancer among those who are not just smokers but who are heavy smokers is more, it's getting more than that. It's found to be 15 to 25 times higher than among those who are non-smokers. So the more that you increase in the exposure, the stronger the association in terms of the number that you get will be. So that strength is one indicative criterion of a more causative rather than a correlated relationship. The second thing is consistency. Consistency is that observation should be consistent by different researchers and in different places and in different circumstances and in different times. And because if you replicate the study, for example, somebody did this study in North America, and then somebody did it in Europe, and other did it in Asia, and one else did it in, for example, in the Arab world, and if you replicate and you get the same results, so this increase our confidence that this association is actually not due to any other error that's happened in that population, or it did not happen by that researcher or that time or that geographical place, and there is no room of this to be wrong, because it gave the same result all over and over again in different places. So this consistency of findings in different populations and different time periods with different locations gives us more also indication of a causative relationship. And then we come to talk about the third criterion, which is specificity. They said that this relation has to be specific, and specificity is a little bit now it's being doubtful, or people start to argue about it, because when it first they said about specificity, they actually meant it to be among infectious diseases, that one infectious disease has to be specifically related to one single effect or microbe or a germ, and not different germs that can cause the same infection disease. But now it's a well-known concept that different risk factors or different variables or exposures are responsible for more than one disease, and it's not specific to only one. For example, smoking. We know that smoking is not only a causative of cancer of the lung, but also cancer of the larynx is well known to be among smokers, cancer of the oral cavity, cancer of the esophagus, cancer of the bladder, of the kidney and the pancreas, as well as many other non-cancerous conditions can also cause can be caused by smoking, like certain heart diseases and certain cardiovascular diseases in general. And so we know that diseases now have more than one cause, yeah, due to tobacco smoke. And we know that, again, even lung cancer, we know by now that it's not only caused by the smoking tobacco or smoking. We know that now asbestos, exposure to asbestos and certain radiation can also cause lung cancer, and vice versa. So but specificity was also listed earlier as one of the criterion. But as we said, because of these changes that we came to know about nowadays, because this criteria was being published in 1965, so it's an old one, but now with the advances that we know in medicine, we know that is not very specifically true. And then temporality. Temporality, I think by now you all understand that for a certain exposure to be more logically to be causative of a certain outcome, it has to occur before. So the direction in time is very important. The exposure has to be there before the outcome to be able to say that it is more causative of it. And I think the concept of temporality is more clear to you now. Then the biological gradient. A biological gradient is another criterion that is being placed, and we thought that it's also indicative of causation. It simply means that there is a dose-response curve and relationship. In other words, the association should be more likely if we change the level of exposure. For example, if you have seen that smoking in general makes it more likely for participants to have lung cancer by tenfolds, so the increase in that exposure should produce a higher incidence of the outcome, or make it more likely, even in a bigger number. And if we go down with exposure or we stop it, that effect should go down on the outcome or disappear, so the outcome will not appear. So if you can prove this biological gradient, then that is more likely that what you are looking at is more of a causative relationship. And then we come to talk about plausibility. Plausibility means that if we are talking about a certain causative or possible causative relationship, we should be able to scientifically prove it, how biologically that could lead to an outcome. Yeah, we cannot just be talking nonsense. So if we can give a model, biological or social model, it depends what you're looking at to explain the association that you look at, then that is more likely to make people believe, or it's a good evidence that it's more of a causative rather than an association. For example, smoking again causes lung cancer, because we know that, if we can explain it further, that cigarettes contain many carcinogenic substances, and these because it's being inhaled, and because it's being inhaled it goes to the lung, and that substance will make the changes in the lung cells more evident then that is more also consistent with that we can biologically explain it. For example, things that cannot be explained is that they have done a small study where they compared the outcome of certain hospitalized cardiac patients. These hospitalized cardiac patients were divided, half of whom were prayed for by strangers, Christians who volunteered for the study, and others were not being prayed for example. And they looked at the outcome of heart attacks, and they found that those who have been prayed for had actually fewer heart attacks and contracted pneumonia less than those who were not being prayed for. And many epidemiologists have difficulty believing that there is an association between being prayed for and these less outcomes compared to the other group, because there is no biological model to explain it, how the praying has probably they have removed that divine power or that evil power or that curse, but because they cannot biologically explain it in scientific way, they speculated that other factors, for example, were at work, and that's why they couldn't believe that there is a causative relationship between being prayed for or no and the outcomes. And this can be debateful, of course, and everyone has his own beliefs about it. And then coming to talk about coherence. Coherence is very close to what we called about the biological plausibility. The only thing is that they mean by coherence that when you interpret the cause and the effect of data, it should be conflicting. It shouldn't be conflicting with what generally known facts of natural history or the biological history of disease. And for example, they found different whatever you say that this biologically can explain the certain outcome, but you also should be able to explain all the other factors that is related to that association. It should be coherent. Your finding should be coherent with all the other things. So, for example, cigarette smoking causes lung cancer is also coherent with other facts that the temporal or the increased rise in both smoking and lung cancer over several decades, because people smoke more, they found to have more lung cancer with time. Because the smoking industry has become wider, because people started more to afford it, because it became part of being manhood to have a smoke. So that's coherent with that finding. And also that the pattern in lung cancer between men and women is different, and you should also be able to explain why it is different. If you think there is a causative relationship between smoking and cancer, then why it is being seen differently among genders. Because women, for example, you were able to see that they began smoking later than men. And then the histopathological evidence from the bronchial epithelium of smokers is also coherent with what we suggest about the tobacco substance is being responsible for these changes. And so it's consistent that you found something in the epithelial cells that shows evidence that actually it came from smoking. For example, if you also test the carcinogenic action of cigarette smoke in laboratory animals and you still find the same finding, so that's also coherent with what you are suggesting. So all coherence means you can relate all the differences that is related to your causative relationship, and you can explain it well. Then that's also supportive. And then experiment. Experiment is that if the experiment, because we know that experiment is the highest level of evidence, if you can do it in an experiment, so outside the setting, the normal setting, and you are also able to establish that correlation. For example, if you put the exposure, you get the outcome. If you increase the exposure, you increase the outcome. If you reduce the exposure or eliminate it, then you don't get the outcome in a very restricted environment where you are sure to eliminate all the other extraneous variables that might create the noise or error, and you were able to do it and prove it, then that's also one bonus point for a causative relationship rather than an association. And then coming to the last point, which is analogy. Analogy means you have to have similarity between the observed association and any other association. For example, if you can, for example, in the past, there was a drug called thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug that, there is a disease called rubella that they're causing certain subsequences among pregnant women, especially for the newborns. And they say that, for example, let me find another maybe better example of that. Okay. For example, yeah, okay, let's go back to this example. The drug thalidomide and rubella, was well known that if you contract these or use this drug during pregnancy, that it is causing certain problems and birth defects in their newborn, and that was a well-known fact. But if you find something else, like another viral disease or another drug that is, you suspect that it's also causing certain birth defects during pregnancy, so you can relate this viral disease action to rubella, which is a known fact, and this is what we call analogy. Or you can relate the effect of that new drug in terms of its action, even if it's a new drug, but you compare it to thalidomide, which is a known fact to cause a birth defect. And if you can find, for example, there is a similarity in their action, and then you observed also the certain birth defects, then you can base this causation based on comparing it to those well-known factors like thalidomide and rubella infection with other viral infections or other drugs. But this also can be debateful, but this is what he meant here by the word analogy. So these are the, I hope they're clear to you now, what are the meanings, the different meanings of these criteria by Hill in assessing causation. Now, continuing with the first of what we think as being what can distort your finding in your study design, and we'll start with bias. So in bias is nothing but it's a systematic error by the investigator, and this error by the investigator could be during the design or the conduct of the study, or even at the interpretation of the study. And this error that is caused mainly by the investigator leads to incorrect association between the exposure or the disease. This can be not even during the analysis, but can be also conducted further during the publication of your paper, so you have to be very careful about. And usually this error that is caused by bias can either overestimate the association that you are looking at, or it can underestimate it. So you might find a strong association and it is actually introduced or resulted from the bias that is being created in your study, or there is a strong association but you were not able to detect it, again because of bias. So it can go either direction. What are the different types of bias? So we said that bias is mainly done and introduced by the researcher and how he designs the study or how he conducts it or how he interprets the results. So, and this is something that if you are aware of, you can very much avoid. And that's why I encourage always students and researchers is always to think of different types of bias according to the study design that they have chosen and how it can be reduced as much as possible. Think about it when you design. Will that be more likely to introduce such and such bias? How can I go around it and change how I select, for example, my cases or my controls or my exposure group or my non-exposure group to avoid all these possible? Even during the using the study tool, using questionnaires or so on, will this introduce any bias? How can I avoid it and how can I get around it? So unless you know the different types or the common types, you won't be able to avoid them. So let's know in this slide what the other major two types of bias. There is something called selection bias, and there's different subtypes underneath that, and there is something called observational bias. So selection bias is an error due again to systematic difference. So there is systematic way that you have introduced a difference in the characteristics between those who have been selected for the study and those who were not selected. And this is from the name, it's how it says. So for example, who is being selected to be part of your sample? Is it being purely coming from the base population? And not being any different than those, so you can refer whatever results you get to that general population or no. And there are different subtypes. Sometimes the selection bias is not around your whole sample, but mainly on your control. More than, for example, your cases. If you're carrying, for example, a case control study, and this is very common in case control study, is that you put a lot of effort, as we have mentioned earlier, to select your cases, and you make sure that they are following the criteria for to be a case and all. And we forget that the control has to be very similar to your cases in their characteristics and not to be any different, so you can make any inferences between them and not to be very different, and or not very similar as well, or having a shared hidden exposure that you're not aware of. And that is what we call as control selection bias. And a good example of this is that, for example, when we said about looking at lung cancer, for example, among people who are smokers, and because your cases are people, for example, with lung cancer, you got it from hospital records, you decided also, and most of them are men, so you decided to take your controls also men who are following up in a hospital to be similar to your cases, not from the general population, which is believed to be healthier. But you failed to choose from which department to pick your controls, and you went to pick them from the respiratory department and those who have emphysema, for example. And you say, okay, emphysema is a different than oncology, than cancer. It's more of respiratory disease that is less less than being having a cancer. But you don't pay attention that one of the main exposure causes or that emphysema is associated mainly with smoking. So those who are very high number of smokers. So it have masked here, you choosing a wrong control or selecting the wrong control mask the effect of smoking on lung cancer, because it would show that even those with emphysema not having lung cancer, not having the outcome, they are supposed to be your controls, were having a high percentage of exposure among them, like your lung cancer patients. So you won't be able to make that association that smoking is related to lung cancer, because they will cancel each other, if that is clear. So that is what we call as a control selection type of bias. Sometimes there is another selection bias, it's called self-selection bias. Some studies where you don't enroll the participant yourself, but you are sending them an invitation, for example, to participate. And now when you send an invitation for people to participate, those who decided to take part in the study and participate and come forward and volunteer might be different, and that's what made them volunteer compared to, for example, your cases. For example, your cases, you have selected them, but for your controls, you will send emails or you will make phone calls and tell them that I have a study so and so. If you like to volunteer, it's up to you. And then those who agree to volunteer might have different characteristics than those who opted not to volunteer. And that characteristics, for example, might affect the relationship that you are studying without paying attention to. And then we have a loss of follow-up. As we mentioned in cohort study design, when you follow participants for a long time, you will lose participants, and these participants are more likely to be lost among your non-exposure than your exposure, because your exposure probably are people who are going to fall sick, and because you have selected them in a certain criteria to make sure that they are more willing to continue to study, to continue in this study or to be in that geographical area. Non-exposed people are not having that exposure of interest. They might find it getting boring to be in a study, doing nothing, just being like non-exposed group or comparison group, and they might move in and out and you lose them. And the fear is that because you are losing more in one arm than the other, then those who have stayed in the study are different than those who have left in their characteristics, and that would affect again your results. So these are different types of selection bias. If we go to look at observational bias, here the observation is not about who's being in or out. Here it's a flaw in measuring the exposure or the outcome. So you are measuring it differently. The information that you are gathering is not accurate, and that will result in differences in the quality of information between the two comparative groups. For example, there is something called recall bias, and this is mainly in case control studies where you use, for example, questionnaires among cases and controls to ask about their behavior. And we have mentioned, I think, this a little bit earlier, that people who are sick normally will tend to remember details more than people who are not sick, because once you are sick, even for us, you will try to remember what I have done wrong. Even in the slightest things, like getting pimples on your face all of a sudden, you will start remembering everything that you ate. Have I tried a new chocolate? Have I tried a new product? Was I stressed lately? Did I touch anything with my hands? Any substance, any chemical that was new recently that most probably caused this? And you will figure it out. And similarly with people who are sick, they might recall their, for example, gastric cancer, and people without gastric cancer. Those with gastric cancer will try to remember what they have done wrong in their life, in their lifestyle, that made them have this disease. So that's part of the blaming process. So they will remember better. For people who are healthy and not sick, they will rarely give any attention to that, and that will make it very difficult for them to remember. And sometimes recall bias can be in the opposite direction. For example, if there are women having birth defects in their babies and compared to women gave birth to babies who are healthy, those with birth defects might know what they have done wrong, like taking certain drugs, um, uh, like narcotic substances during pregnancy, drinking alcohol or smoking, and they will be actually not willing to admit it because of the blame or of the guilt. So they purposely will not give the right information compared to those who have done probably the same things, but because they got babies who are healthy, so there is no harm of mentioning any bad or wrong behavior that they have done. So this is how they remember. Recall bias is how they can remember. There is something called interviewer bias, and this is mainly done if the researcher is being involved in getting the information. So it is not being self-reported like in recall bias. Or sometimes recall bias, it's not self-reported, but just simply they cannot remember. In interviewer bias, it's mostly that the researcher wants himself, for certain reasons, to prove certain association, and he will probe and he will try to ask the questions in a way to make that exposure more prevalent among cases compared to controls to prove that association. So the way he asks the question, the questions that he asks, the probes that he uses to make them admit to one answer more than the other. And then coming to misclassification bias. Misclassification bias is simply who do you decide to be a case and who do you decide to be a control. And similarly, for example, in cohort study, who you decide to be labeled as exposed compared to those who are being labeled unexposed. If you made a mistake in putting your inclusion and exclusion criteria, you might mix them up. So those who you consider to be non-exposed and actually exposed, but because your criteria in their inclusion was not rigid enough, you have missed them and you involved them in the group to be unexposed. Again, for cases and controls, if you remember the example that we gave of chest pain, and what you are interested in was people with MI. So you consider everyone with chest pain to have an MI, while actually most of them were not having MI, they were having musculoskeletal chest pain, or they were having just an acid reflux. So you have wrongly placed them as your controls. So this is what we call as misclassification for both exposure status or outcome status. And if this mix up might eliminate or mask the association if it was there, because of again an error in the in your observation or in your classification. So these are the main different types of bias, and I hope it's clear to you from this slide. Coming to talk about confounding, and we have touched upon this priorly, so we'll talk a little bit more about it in confounding. Confounding is a different thing in your research that can be there, and if you don't pay attention, it can also introduce error. So in confounding, it means that there is a natural mixing of effects between the exposure and the outcome, and there is always a third variable that is called a confounder. And if you don't pay attention to that, you might get into wrong interpretation of your study findings. Like bias, confounding also distort the relationship between the exposure and the outcome. And if we come to talk about it here, as we said, for example, this is your exposure, let's say drinking coffee, and your outcome is cancer, for example lung cancer or bladder cancer, and you found that people who are drinking coffee a lot are more likely to have, for example, bladder cancer. But actually, if you see here that this relationship is being confounded by a third variable, this third variable is called a confounder, and here it is smoking. It's actually not drinking coffee that made it associated with cancer, but because most people who drink coffee heavily are actually also smokers, and it is actually the smoking that is more associated with, more direct associated with the bladder cancer than the coffee itself. So the confounder has different rules. For anything to be called a confounder. A confounder has to be independently associated with the exposure, and it has to be independently associated with the outcome, and then it should not be part of the process of this exposure causing the outcome. For example, another study where they have looked at those who are diabetic and the outcome of Alzheimer. And they forgot about a third confounder, which is age. Because age is associated with being diabetic, and age is also associated with having Alzheimer. So it was actually not being diabetic that directly causes in the biological interpretation that causes Alzheimer, but it is actually the old age of people who are diabetic. So things like that, unless you are aware a little bit about it, you won't be able to control it. So how we can also, for example, in this study say that no, even coffee by itself, even if they were not smokers, it will increase the risk of bladder cancer. How can we prove this? There is a way in the interpretation or in the analysis where you can mask the effect of smoking, but unless you know about it and mask it, you will be able to study this type of association. If you are not aware of it or you have missed it, then you might giving a wrong interpretation. And this what we meant also by in the first example when we talked about not being married and having a risk of breast cancer. It is not the marriage, but because most people who are not married are actually childless. Yeah, so you can also look at this relationship. But for example, if you look at if you look at different examples, if something, for example, if we look at any risk factor, okay, and the outcome, and actually in this process there is an intermediate process that in the biological explanation of this has led to the outcome, then this here is not a confounder. For example, they found that people who drank alcohol in small or moderate amounts, they are more likely to not have cardiovascular diseases. So and with further testing and investigations, they found that those who drink alcohol less actually will have a reduced in their HDL type, they will have high HDL level of cholesterol, and we know that the HDL is the good cholesterol. Okay, so because they drink less, they will increase their HDL, and the high HDL is more protective of cardiovascular events. Here HDL, because it is in the biological pathway of how the exposure leads to the outcome, here it is not considered a confounder. So this might be a little bit more advanced for you, but here from this slide what you need really to understand is the meaning of the third variable, who is a confounder, and I hope that this example has explained it. And it's very important for you to be able to control possible confounders is to know them beforehand in designing your study, so you can gather information about it and have it for all your participants only then you can have it as a variable, extra variable, like if you're thinking about age or employment or educational status or socioeconomic status, or gender, or smoking status as confounded. You have to collect this data. Although you're not studying it, what you're studying is the coffee intake and the cancer, but you have to get all information of possible confounders. Unless you have the information in your data, you can control for it in the analysis. Then we come to talk about random error, and we are coming to the end of this lecture. So random error is the only thing that you cannot actually control for. Like confounder, it's there. You have to be with your best knowledge to know it, to be able to control it. Bias, you can also try to think about it and how it can be introduced and come around with different ways and methods to minimize it as much as possible. But random error is the thing is that is uncontrollable force, and it's unsystematic, unlike the confounders and the bias. It's here the probability that what you have observed is just simply due to chance. So it's due to chance. So it is uncontrollable and it's unforeseeable. So you cannot even predict it in the process. And usually, to get around random error, this you have to think about it when you state your hypothesis. And usually it is being controlled by the sample size. So you see that when you will come to see that when I'm not sure if this has been covered already in SPSS or no, but in calculating your sample size, they will always give room for errors. They will say, do you want your sample to be calculated based on, for example, 5% error or 10% error? So according to this error, you will change your sample size, and this is just a way or an attempt to make sure that if anything happened by chance, I'll be able to tell. So if any finding I found it happened to be by chance, I'll be at least able to see how likely is my results due to chance. And that is being given always, if you read published paper, as a p-value. Is this association statistically significant or not? So this, when you say statistically significant or not, and giving a 95% confidence interval, for example, you say an odds ratio I found of 2.1, but it can be, that is always between brackets. If you look at studies, it can be anywhere between 1.1 and, for example, 4.6. So this gives you the range of possible error, but it still tells you that there is a positive association, for example. And so you don't have to worry much about these details, but at least you have to understand that random error, it's due to chance, and it is something that you cannot control for very powerfully during the conduct or the design of the study, but you can somehow get around it with the best you can during your stating your hypothesis and calculating your sample size, and can be given as a p-value to tell the reader how likely is what you have found is by chance. So the less that it is likely to be due to chance, the more your results will be accredited. Coming now to the final point or the final objective, and I'm sorry I'm taking a little bit long in today's lecture, but I think these are very important concepts that is best being put in one lecture for you to relate them all together, but it's very important for you to understand them in epidemiology. There is something called, I'm sure you heard about, internal validity of the study and external validity. And by now you know the word validity means how accurate is your result of your study is. So internal validity is mainly the extent to which a study is trustworthy, and that cause and effect relationship between what you have studied is something that is true, basically is true. Internal validity also reflects that a given study that whatever finding you found, you can eliminate all the possible other alternative explanation for your finding. And so basically, it is how rigorous your study is being designed and conducted, and how have you eliminated and controlled for all the bias and all the confounders, to tell me that your results are actually due to X being associated with Y, and not because there was different types of bias being introduced, and there is no confounders that have also played a major role in the association, because you know them and you can define them and you have controlled for them. So it is most likely what I have found is not because confounders, it's not because bias, it's because what actually X is associated with Y. So this is what we call internal validity, is how well the study is being conducted in a correct way, and the confounders and bias are minimized as much as possible. So this is what we call internal validity. While external validity is saying that whatever results you have, whatever study you have looked at, whatever population you have conducted the study on, and the results you found, how applicable it is to the other circumstances, or to the world outside, or to different, how generalizable your findings to the population that have given rise to your sample, or to different circumstances in other geographical areas. If I found, for example, that smoking is associated with lung cancer, how well you have conducted the study that you can apply this and generalize this finding. It's not about whether it is correct or no, but how the way you have selected your sample from the referent population, that you can generalize your finding, that that it can go out to the real world, and, for example, be applicable to all people, for example, who are smokers, or your sample was actually not representative of the real population who smoke, and therefore you cannot refer the findings back to them. So this is what we call as external validity. So I hope by this that it is exactly 1 hour now, so we went 10 minutes beyond time. Sorry for that, but I hope that in today's lecture everything is really very clear to you. Please make sure that you understand each and everything in it. It's very important for your future research career, and not career only, for your projects that are coming up. And these are very basic, fundamental concepts in epidemiology studies that you need to understand, even when you read published papers, to be aware of these things, to judge yourself how true what you are reading. So unless you know this information, you will be able to avoid making such mistakes when it comes to your own study. Just to let you know that this is going to be my last lecture with you, but I'm always available online for a month until now, because I'll be going into my maternity leave. I'll be happy until end of November to receive any queries, any questions through email, and to answer them or help you out with anything that you need help with. And I wish you all the very best of luck for this course, and hope you all stay safe, and I guess bye bye for now. Thank you all, and goodbye.